All right, so let's get started on today's meeting. So today we're going to continue with our look at chapter 12, problem solving and creativity. So this is problem solving and creativity part 2. But before we dive back in to why certain problems are very difficult to solve, why they pose that obstacle that we seemingly can't get out of our way, I just wanted to shed some light or bring your attention to a news story that popped up on my feed yesterday, and it has to do with our look at connectionist networks. So if you recall, we took a look at connectionist networks, these parallel distributed processing networks, and we look at this one that had the ability to recognize numbers, and it had 784 input units, it had 10 output units, and it had a multitude of connections between those units. So one of the things that I mentioned was that these models can get incredibly complex, and they actually need programs that can do the calculations about how to nudge the weights and the connections and the activations in different ways to optimize the model so that it can perform the task it's supposed to perform. These things can get very complicated. However, just how complicated an actual brain is was recently shown in the Microns project. So this is a series of papers that were published in the journal Nature. And this is a data set of high resolution images of individual cells in a mouse's visual cortex. They have actually been able to image the actual neurons and the actual connections for a 1 millimeter cubed amount of brain matter. So basically, brain matter that is the size of a speck of sand, they're able to map out exactly where all the neurons are and where all the connections are. So this actually turns out to be 200,000 cells and approximately 523 million connections. So that is the equivalent if you took every single one of those connections and you laid them end to end, the distance of the actual connections in this 1 millimeter cubed mouse cortex is actually the length of an entire football field. Oh, wait a second, I misread that. It's the length of 61 football fields. So in this 1 millimeter cubed, 61, in this 1 millimeter cubed piece of brain matter, if you count the number of connections and the number of synapses that connect to neurons and you map out all of those connections in total will be 61 football fields long in that 1 millimeter cubed piece of mouse brain. So you can imagine what the entire mouse's brain must entail, how many connections, how many neurons, how many bajillions of these different connections we can have. You can imagine how much more complicated our bigger brains are going to be. And just given all of that complexity, two things kind of popped up in my mind that I just wanted to bring up. Number one, the human brain, and by extension, the mind that it implements, along with other aspects such as the environment. But the human mind has to be one of the most complicated things in the universe. So just vastly massive in its computational complexity. And that complexity exists. And yet, however, even with vastly more simple models, like the ones that we just took a look at, we can do a lot of the human-like cognition that we are able to do with our massive human brain computational systems. So it does seem to be that things like this should be technically impossible if that's all that your brain is doing. On the other hand, we do have vastly simplistic models compared to what actually is existing in biology, and yet we're still able to program these neural networks, these parallel distributed processing models, in a way that can produce cognitive behaviors. All right, so that was just something that popped up yesterday. I wanted to bring some light to it. Now we're going to get back to problem solving and creativity. And today we're going to take a look at some of the issues that your mind faces with problem solving and some of the issues that actually blocks creativity, because those two go hand in hand. Oftentimes when you're doing a problem, your first option doesn't lead to the solution, so then you need to create second options. And what we're going to see is that oftentimes when your mind tries to solve a problem and it fails, what it does is it gets very, very angry and noticing that it failed. And then it'll go back and it'll try the same thing again. And then it'll get angry and fail again, and it'll go back and try the same thing, anger, try the same thing, anger, try the same thing, anger. And we're going to see that that is part of the reason why your human mind runs into problems that are extremely difficult to solve. All right, enough of this. Let's get on with the rest of today. So today we're going to have a quick recap on what a problem is. We're going to revisit the wordies. Quick recap on one of the reasons problem solving can be so challenging, which is our failure to restructure the problem. But then we'll take a look at other reasons, such as functional fixedness, such as getting stuck in a mental set. We're going to see incubation effects, which is actually a way to help you solve problems. And then we'll take a look at insight problems and why their structure makes them very, very difficult to solve. And then if we have time after this, we're going to start discussing, taking a look at problem spaces. So we'll see where we get to, and let's start it up. So just as a quick recap of what a problem is, problem requires two things. One, there has to be an obstacle between your present state, where you are, and your goal state, where you want to be. And two, it has to be not immediately obvious how you're going to get around that obstacle. So we saw some examples of this, for example, with Kohler's chimpanzee studies, where the chimpanzees don't have a banana, that's their present state. The chimpanzees want a banana, that's their goal state. There's an obstacle in between them, such as a wall, such as the banana is too high up, and it's not immediately obvious how to get there, but through problem solving, they're able to get around the obstacle and either climb up to get the banana or maybe use a stick to reach that banana. And what we're going to do now is we're going to revisit the wordies. So just by way of review, these are those picture word puzzles that illustrate that common phrase or word. So here we have Daffy, Donald, and Mallard. These are three ducks. They are all in a row. So this is the phrase ducks in a row, or get your ducks in a row. So we are going to try to solve the following wordies again. So these are the same ones that we saw last time. So if you've already solved them, that's wonderful. If you haven't, here is attempt number 2. All right, so we are going to get to the answers to these today, but before we get there, was anybody able to solve one of the problems, one of the wordies that they were not able to solve last time? Did anybody come up with a solution this time for either this, or this, where it wasn't apparent last time, but now you got the solution? All right, well, we'll give it a little bit more time before we get to those solutions. But right now, let's turn to the idea of what is this challenge to problem solving? What makes certain problems difficult to solve? What are these obstacles between the present state and your goal? And what makes it very difficult to remove those obstacles? Why is it that sometimes we are just not able to remove those obstacles? So the first reason for this that we took a look at is the failure to restructure the problem when you're trying to solve it. And basically using the representation that you start with over and over and over again in order to solve the problem. Whereas if you were able to restructure the problem and use a different representation, it would make solving the problem easier. It would make solving the problem possible. So the example that we took a look at was the monk on a hill, where a monk begins his trip up a hill at 9 a.m. on one morning and ends up at the top of the hill at 9 p.m. that day. He then spends the night on top of the hill and begins his trek down at 9 a.m. the next morning and walks all the way down and arrives at 9 p.m. that day. And the question is, can he traverse this trip so that he is not in the same location on the same time on those two separate days? So is he able to traverse this and walk up the hill in a certain way so that when he walks down the hill, maybe in a different way, he is not going to be at the same point on the hill at the same time on both of those days? And as we saw, this is a very difficult problem to solve when you structure it as two separate trips on two separate days. However, when you go through restructuring and you say, well, let's take a look at a new representation of this problem, and let's consider the same monk, but we'll overlap the 2 days that he's traveling. Well, once you do that, it becomes immediately apparent that there is no way that he could traverse that hill so that he would not be at the same point at the same time on those two different trips. So that was a sort of illustrative example. And then we briefly talked about Rory Sutherland's example, his real world example, about trying to solve the complaints on the Eurostar London to Paris train. And millions of pounds were being spent trying to make the train faster, trying to build new tracks to reduce the travel time. And that was structuring the problem in an engineering way, using engineering representations. And his argument was that if you structured it as a psychological problem, the problem would be much easier to solve. So you wouldn't actually make the train faster, but you would put Wi-Fi on the train so that the trip didn't seem as long, so that it would be productive. You would make the seats better. You would hire incredibly attractive people to serve all-you-can-drink alcohol on the train, and people would ask you to slow the train down. All these solutions become readily apparent once you restructure the problem and say, well, this isn't an engineering problem, this is a psychology problem, and then all of a sudden, the solutions become more apparent. All right, so other challenges to problem solving. One of the other challenges that makes problems difficult to solve is the fact that we fall prey to what is known as functional fixedness. And functional fixedness is where we restrict the use of objects to their familiar functions. So when we're trying to solve a problem, we often have resources that we can use, we often have objects that we can use, and functional fixedness is where a solution could be obtained, but it requires you to use something in an unfamiliar way, and we block ourselves and simply restrict the use of an object to its familiar functions. So this is something that is oftentimes shown on any sort of article about 13 hacks on how to use a fork, for example. So you might find these articles, 13 hacks on how to use a fork. And we all know what a fork is for. A fork is to hold your food down on the plate while you cut it, and then you bring your food to your mouth. But forks can be used in other ways. So if you're stuck with functional fixedness, you see a fork and you're like, okay, fork is for food and fork is for eating. That's what a fork is for. But if you're trying to solve a problem, sometimes you can use forks in other ways. If you've ever seen one of these videos, you can put two forks together and use them to hold a hard-boiled egg on a table. You can use a fork and a screw as a cork opener for a bottle of wine. You can use forks to make straight lines when you're doing your makeup. You can use forks to help you hang a picture on a wall. You can use forks for many other things than for solving the problem that you are faced with. So you might be able to use forks and jam them into computers to make videos play. I'm not sure about that, but you can use them in different ways. And if you fail to solve the problem of how can you support an egg on a table when you don't have an egg holder, you'll fail to solve the problem if you don't see the potential of using 2 forks as a stand for that egg. All right, so functional fixedness, you restrict the use of an object to its familiar functions, and you solve the problem using the most common representations. So you solve a problem by thinking about things in the most common, most straightforward, most typical way, and you fail to use other representations that are possible to solve the problem because you are fixed on the most typical, most familiar functions for this solution. So one of my favorite examples of this is the hole in the wall. So if you ever came across a hole that was shaped like this, you know exactly what happened in this particular situation. Somebody burst through that wall or was thrown through that wall. And importantly, you know where their head went, and you know where their arms went, and you know where their legs went. And a hole like this, you pass through that with your arms through the upper 2 openings, with your head through that upper middle opening, with your body through the middle opening, with your legs through the bottom 2 openings. That's how you pass through that hole. And unbeknownst to you, probably through years and years of watching cartoons, you have been conditioned to think of this hole in that way and and you fall into functional fixedness if you are thinking about ways to get through that hole. So my favorite example of this comes from a Japanese game show. It's called Human Tetris. I will apologize for the low res, but it is difficult to get clips of this show, especially with, as we're going to see, the explanations. So without further ado, let's take a look at real people in an incredibly fake situation, but trying to solve the problem of how do I fit my body through the hole that is coming towards me and is going to push me into the water.
ルールは簡単。プレイヤーは様々な形にくり抜かれた壁を的確なポーズですり抜けられると10ポイント獲得。しかし、抜けられない場合は壁に激突、哀れ水の中へ。頑張って頑張って。お楽勝。さあコンビ愛コンビ愛。手なんかいらないで多分。手いらないんだ。いやの前だったさあコンビ愛。息の合ったところどうか。無理だ。難しい。さあよく考えて。脳を使ってさあどうか。抜けたクリア。予想している。さあこれは難しそうだ。さあ弾丸ジャッキーいけるか。どうする。おっとしゃがみ弾丸ジャッキーだ。ただ脳を使ってさあ脳を使ってこの形むずいんですけどね。ドライブです。ドライブのイメージです。さあ文字像どうする文字像。一見ですよ。難しいよな。一瞬だ。この後東京スターチームが文字像を共に成功したのに対し田舎チームは堤文字板森と連続で失敗。個人戦最後の田舎西の挑戦が勝負のキーポイントに。さあ ロサ会館が迫ってきた。長身の2人は立っている。さあロサ会中さんはかなり嫌がってます。藤本さん。あれヘルメットかぶってないのが。藤本さんですね。
この後すごいよまた。
このツーショット。
All right, so we had some successes, we had some fails, but importantly and illustratively for functional fixedness, let's take a look at when they were successful and when they failed. When they were able to solve the problem, how do I fit my body through this hole? And when did they not solve the problem of how do I fit my body through this hole? So let's take a look at this example here. This one was actually solved successfully. And one of the reasons, or what functional fixedness would argue was the reason that this was solved successfully, is because when they looked at the hole, there was no representation that was the most common way to represent how do you fit through that hole. There was no typical solution that was the solution of how do you fit through that hole. You just have a hole there that you need to fit through. Importantly, there's no place that your arm is supposed to go. There's no place that your leg is supposed to go. There's no place that your head is supposed to go. And because of that, this individual was able to solve that problem correctly because he didn't fall prey to functional fixedness, and he was able to apply representations that allowed him to solve this problem. On the other hand, for this hole right here, this was when a contestant failed. And in this one right here, it looks like a baby doing a boat pose, I guess, in yoga. But very importantly, it's a human-shaped hole. So when you see this hole, if you fall victim to functional fixedness, you're going to take a look at this representation and you are going to apply the most typical representations to solving this problem. And you're going to say to yourself, oh, okay, there's a human-shaped hole. And for human-shaped holes, I know where certain parts go. The head has to go into the head hole, right? And the legs are going to have to go where the legs are. Rather than looking at what is the entire hole and trying to solve that problem without being limited through functional fixedness, for this functions as the hole for the head, this functions as the hole for the legs. So what happens is this individual tries to solve this problem in exactly that way, falls prey to functional fixedness and says, my head has to go here, my legs have to go here, head goes in the head hole, legs go in the leg hole. And the reason that we're looking at this example specifically is because this is one where they actually show the solution. Solution's right there. They actually show the solution of how to solve this correctly. And to solve it correctly, you have to get rid of your functional fixedness and use the spaces in that hole in a way that is not immediately apparent, or in a way that is not the typical way of solving that problem. So the head actually goes right there. So you want to lie on your back. The head goes where the butt part of the human hole is. One of your legs will go where the leg hole is, but the other leg goes through the torso hole. So this was failed because this individual fell prey to that functional fixedness, got stuck in a particular way of thinking about that hole, and only applied the solution that fit with that representation. One more example here. We saw this example where this individual was successful in solving this problem and was successful in going through this hole. And the reason is because he did not fall prey to functional fixedness. He did not get stuck with functional fixedness. So in this case, again, we have the human-shaped hole. It looks like a human in a driving the car position. So there's the head hole. That's where your head should go. There's the leg hole. That's where your legs should go. And if you try to solve the problem in that way, then you're going to fail. However, if you take a look at this whole and do not apply those typical functional fixedness representations to it, then you can come up with what was actually an incredibly easy solution where I'm going to put my head where the head hole is, but my legs are not going to go where the leg hole is. My legs are just going to walk right through the torso part of that hole. And he was able to solve that correctly. So it would be a really interesting study to take a look at this game show, and functional fixedness would predict that shapes that are abstract, shapes that do not look like human forms, should be solved at a much higher rate than shapes that look like human forms. And of the shapes that look like human forms, they would be solved at a much higher success rate if you don't actually use them in a functional fixedness type way, where the head hole is where your head goes, the leg hole is where your legs go, the arm hole is where your arm goes, and actually apply different representations to where your legs and head can go in order to solve these problems. All right, so that's functional fixedness. Let's now take a look at our next challenge to problem solving. What is another reason why we get stuck trying to solve a problem? And one of the other reasons, it's related to functional fixedness. Sometimes it gets a little bit confusing which one is functional fixedness and which one is not. But this is the idea of a mental set. And this is bringing preconceived notions on how to solve a problem, typically because the strategy that you employed has been successful in the past. So whereas functional fixedness, you're bringing the ways that you typically use different items, different objects, and the way that you typically, the strategies that you typically use for different objects and different items. Mental set is when you have been successful in the past with those strategies, and now you bring that to either the continuation of the problem or to a brand new problem. So I'll show you what I mean with the eggs in a basket riddle. So this is the riddle. Let's see if we can solve it. There are 6 eggs in a basket. 6 people take one of the eggs each. No eggs are added to the basket. How is it that one egg can still be left in the basket? So there are 6 eggs in a basket. 6 people take one of the eggs each. No eggs are added to the basket. So how is it that one egg can still be left in the basket? Does anybody think they have a solution? So how many people do not have a solution? How many people have really tired arms and just can't do it? Okay, so who thinks that they do have a solution? All right, so pretty challenging problem. What's the solution? The 6th person could have taken the basket and the egg. That actually is the solution. So the question now is that's not a very complicated idea, right? That the 6th person took the basket along with the egg, and that's why the egg is still in the basket. So everybody has 1 egg each. Everybody took 1 egg each, but the last person actually grabbed the basket. So why is it that only one of us was able to solve that problem? Why is it that we were not able to get around that obstacle of how do we have that last egg in the basket? Well, one of the explanations for this is that you fell into a mental set trap. And you had a preconceived notion on how you're going to solve the problem, and you just kept applying that same operator over and over and over again. So again, the solution to this is you have your basket, you have your 6 eggs, and step 1, person takes an egg. So you got one person comes down, they take 1 egg, and importantly for the mental set, you take a look at your problem and you think to yourself, all right, well, I need to get to the end point where everybody has an egg and there's still an egg in a basket. And I've done step 1, and now we have one person that has an egg. So if you take a look at the problem space, which is something we'll talk about later today, if you take a look at the problem space, you can definitely see that you've made progress, right? We had nobody with an egg, 6 eggs in the basket. Now we got 5 eggs in the basket, 1 person with an egg. We're closer to the solution. So this move, person 1 takes an egg, that works. Well, let's try it again. So you think to yourself, all right, the next person comes up and they take an egg. Person 2 takes an egg. And now you're even closer to where you want to go. Everybody has an egg, 1 egg left in the basket. And you do it for person 3. And you do it for person 4. And you do it for person 5. And what happens is that by the time you get to person 5, you have been very successful so far in traversing this problem space. You've been very successful in getting closer and closer and closer. You've had 5 successes where applying the strategy has been successful. And because of that, you get stuck in that mental set. And you think to yourself, all right, person 6 is going to take an egg and they're going to do it the same way person 1 through 5 did because that's worked so far. But wait a second, if they did that, then there's no egg in the basket. So how can I do that? And it's very hard to break out of that and say, well, person 6 takes the egg and they take the basket as well. And that's how you can solve this problem. So it would not be very difficult if I came to you and I said, all right, we have a basket with 1 egg in it. And one person is going to end up with that egg. But when they do, that egg is still going to be in the basket. You'd probably look at me and say, well, they just took the basket. Like that's not even a problem, right? You don't have that obstacle between your goal and your present state. But when you take it up to 6 eggs, those 5 successful solutions have tricked your brain, tricked your mind into saying, oh, this is the way to do things. This is the way that we're going to get closer and closer to the solution so that when you get to that last step and you need to change your strategy, you are stuck in that mental set and it makes it very difficult to solve that problem. All right, so that was mental set. So far we've taken a look at functional fixedness, we've taken a look at mental set, we've taken a look at restructuring. These are things that prevent you from being able to solve a problem. Now we're going to take a look at incubation effects. And this is something that actually helps you solve a problem. So incubation effects are actually helpful in problem solving. And this is where, and I'm sure everybody has had this experience, this is where you set aside a problem for a period of time after unsuccessfully attempting to solve it. And this will often lead to a quick solution when you return to the problem. So the idea is that you've been trying to solve this problem. It's not been working. It's not been working. It's not been working. You say to yourself, you know what? I'm going to take a break. I'm going to come back to this at a later time. You go somewhere else. You distract yourself. You come back to the problem that you've been working on for an hour. You sit down and in 30 seconds, you're like, oh my gosh, there it is. There's the solution. Now I get it. One person takes the entire basket with the egg. Oh, of course. It's so simple. Yep. Yeah, exactly. I mean, we've all had that moment where we were trying to figure something out, and then as soon as we let it go, or as soon as we give up on finding the solutions for whatever reason, maybe turning in that exam, a couple of seconds later, you're just like, oh, there it is. There's the final solution. So yeah, it is something that is indicative of how our minds work. So what is actually going on? What is actually causing these incubation effects? Well, intuitively, many people propose, and psychologists tested this as well, the incorrect explanation. And the incorrect explanation is that basically your unconscious mind is processing the elements of this problem without you knowing it. And it's putting it together in the background. You're working on this problem in the background. And if you just give yourself enough time, your unconscious mind will be able to solve the problem. And then it'll pop up into your consciousness when you come back. And that's why you solve the problem. That would be a very intuitive and elegant solution, but that's actually not what seems to be occurring. The best explanation that has the most research backing it is that what is occurring in the incubation effects is basically you're breaking your mental set. You're basically getting out of that mental set trap that you gave yourself by forgetting the inappropriate strategies that got brought about by these set effects. So you walk away from the problem and you forget about that probably 1 or 2 strategies that you were trying over and over and over again for the solution. And when you come back to the problem, because you forgot those strategies, you're more likely to be out of your mental set and able to think of a new creative strategy that might be the solution. So let's take a look to see if we can get any incubation. Let's try to solve one more time the following wordies. So we got this first one here. So just a show of hands, does anybody have a solution for this? We got a couple. Did anybody who are any of those solutions that came about today? Did they come about? Well, yeah, you. Okay. For people that were here last time. Did any of these, well, I'll ask it in another way. Did any of these come to you after you saw them last time in class? Okay, so in that case, we got no incubation effects here. So what is the solution for this one? Exactly. So this is 3 blind mice. So it's the word mice 3 times, but the mice don't have any eyes, so they're blind. So hence we got 3 blind mice. All right. What about this one? How many people have solved this one? Okay, did anybody solve this after seeing it last time? All right, so what is the solution? 9 to 5. So this is the phrase 9 to 5, which is supposed to be the typical workday, I think, in American culture. So 2 things that I just kind of pop into my brain about this. I remember, I think it was about 6 months ago, maybe a year ago, where somebody was trying to get 5 to 9 kind of trending as the new work ethic for Americans. Like you work from 5 a.m. to 9 p.m. and that's what you need to be successful. And that is just like a hard no in terms of does it actually work psychologically. If you ever want to really get frustrated about the way that businesses conduct their business, take a look at what has psychologically been shown to be productive, and then take a look at what employers have their workers do, and the disconnect between those two just is mind-boggling. So that's one thing that popped into my mind. My other thing was I had a Chinese immigrant student take this class one time, and he did not solve this wording. And when I gave the solution, 9 to 5, he still looked at me and said, "What does that mean?" And when I explained that it means you start work at 9 a.m. and you end work at 5 p.m., he was shocked and just couldn't understand. Like, you don't really? Like, that's a saying? So yeah, different cultures have different sort of expectations on what you can, what you should be doing. All right, next one. This is the most challenging one. So did anybody solve this one? Did you solve it after leaving class?
Yes.
Oh, okay. So we have one incubation effect. What do you think it is?
I'm not sure if this is right. I want to ask a preliminary question.
Sure.
Does it have to do with the word sight?
Yes.
Okay. Then I have 3 guesses.
Okay.
Out of sight, line of sight, or short sight.
All of those are incorrect. All of those are actually really good guesses. And when we get to insight problems, we'll understand how it is possible that you came up with those 3 types of solutions that make sense, but actually aren't the ones that this wordy was looking for. Yep.
I just didn't go what they were saying. Is it hindsight?
It's not hindsight. It does involve sight. So what's missing from the word sight? Yep. It is no end in sight. So the correct solution for this is that the word is supposed to be sight, but the word is supposed to end with a T. There is no T, so there is no end. There is no end in sight. And then the last one here. Did anybody get this one? Yep.
Space Invaders.
So this is Space Invaders. So the word is vaders, but there's a space inside of it. So you got a space, and it's in vaders. And I was hoping maybe this one would be primed, because just by chance I was talking about Space Invaders when we were talking about the AI video game, parallel distributed processing networks. But again, not immediately apparent, but still very difficult to solve if you don't have that right strategy that you're applying. Yep. And as we were discussing earlier, that was unintentional as well. It just came about. But one of the things that the incubation effects will do is, let's say that you were looking at this one and you were thinking about, well, that centerpiece there, something is missing, right? You come in with a strategy and you think to yourself, well, there's something missing in the middle. So maybe that's it. Maybe it's VAD missing middle ERS. And you're like, well, wait, no, that's nothing. Okay, maybe it's missing middle VAD ERS. And you're like, no, that's not anything. And then you're like, well, maybe it's like missing middle then ERS, but before VAD. And you're like, no, that's not nothing. And what you'll find is that oftentimes you keep trying the same solution just in different forms over and over and over again. So you're going to think missing middle, that's got to be something about it. And you just keep going with missing middle, missing middle, missing middle, missing middle. When you leave this problem and then come back to it at a later time, you have a higher probability of forgetting your missing middle strategy and coming to it and applying a new strategy. So you might come to this and you might say, oh, well, there's a space there. Wait, there's a space in there. I know, it's ERS space and then VAD. No, wait, that's not it. But now you're on the right solution strategy, and eventually you'll get to space invaders. So that incubation effect is where, again, you take a step away, forget your strategies, get out of that mental set, and then you're able to come back and increase your probability that you're going to apply that right strategy. It doesn't guarantee it, but at the very least, you're not trying the same thing over and over and over again. As I mentioned before, you're actually going to a real plan B rather than plan B just being plan A again. All right, and then the last type of problem, or the last challenge to problem solving that we're going to take a look at and what makes problems difficult to solve is the idea of the insight problem. And the insight problem is one of those problems where just by their very nature, just by their structure, just by, as we're going to see soon, their problem space, insight problems are challenging. So insight problems are those class of problems in which people are unaware that they're close to a solution. So the eggs in the basket problem is not an insight problem, because you are very aware that you're getting closer to the solution. I got 6 eggs in the basket, nobody has an egg. Then I got 1 person has an egg, 5 eggs in the basket. I got 2 people have an egg, 4 eggs in the basket. You know that you're getting closer. Math problems are oftentimes not insight problems. You know you're working through that math problem. But insight problems are these problems where you're unaware that you're close to a solution. And the reason for this is that they often only require one step. They're one-step solutions. And when you find that step, it becomes immediately obvious and you have that aha moment. But until you find that step, you are lost in the weeds and unable to come up with that correct solution. So let's take a look at an insight problem. So this is known as the haystack problem. So the haystack was important because the cloth ripped. So why did the cloth ripping make the haystack important? Mm-hmm.
Because someone was standing
Okay, so somebody was standing on a cloth and it ripped and they fell on the haystack. That would make the haystack important because the cloth ripped, but that's not the correct solution. Any other possibilities? So the challenge with this riddle here is that there's a number of different potential solutions, most of which are going to be incorrect. So you could be sitting there and you might be saying, well, maybe they were transporting hay to feed the animals and the hay was in the cloth and the cloth ripped. So all the hay spewed out behind them. So now they had no hay to feed the animals, but luckily there was a haystack right there So the haystack became important because the cloth ripped. Or maybe they are farmers that sell hay and clothing to the local town, and their cloth that was going to buy them food for the week ripped. So now they can't sell it, but at least they have that haystack, and they can go and they can sell the haystack, and they can get the money that way. The haystack was important because the cloth ripped. I'm trying to think of another one. I've kind of tapped out at this moment, but you can think of, yep. So you have a sack full of puppies, and you don't want those puppies to get injured, and they fall out, and then you get them into the haystack. Maybe you were hiding behind the cloth. Maybe there was like a serial killer, and they were going to murder you, and you were hiding behind a cloth, but all of a sudden the cloth ripped, and now you're exposed. Well, now you can jump into the haystack, and you can hide in there. None of these solutions are correct. All of these solutions fit the problem. The actual solution is there's your haystack and there's your cloth. And once you see it, all of a sudden it's readily apparent. And the reason is because this is a one-step solution. You need to understand that the cloth is a parachute. And as soon as you know that the cloth is a parachute, the haystack being important, you can solve that. But importantly, notice that nothing else that we said was inconsistent. None of the other solutions were inconsistent for the haystack being important because the cloth ripped. However, none of them were the correct solution, and that is one of the hallmarks of that insight problem. So I'll give you a slightly more complicated one. This one made the rounds about 7 years ago. And it's a riddle, not a psychology test, but here we go. It's called the funeral problem. So I'll read it out. This is a story about a woman. While at the funeral of her own mother, she met a guy whom she did not know. She thought this guy was amazing, so much the dream guy that she was searching for that she fell in love with him immediately. However, she never asked for his name or number, and afterward could not find anyone who knew who he was. A few days later, the girl killed her own sister. Question, why did she kill her sister? Are you sure? Are you pretty sure you know the answer? Okay, does anybody have any possible suggestions for why she might have killed her sister? All right, what do you think? Oh, okay. Once again, consistent, not the correct solution for this one. So any other ideas why she might have killed her sister? So she didn't know the guy's name. She didn't have his number, no way to contact him. Possibility?
Was she hallucinating that he was there?
Not hallucinating that he was there. Yep, that's the answer. So this was put forward as a test to see if you're a psychopath or not, with psychopaths being the ones that would immediately come to that solution. Spoiler alert for anybody that's taken a personality psychology course, it's not. In any one question psychology quiz is bogus. But anyways, the answer is, she reasoned that if the guy appeared at her mother's funeral, then he might appear at another family funeral. So she went out and she killed her sister, hoping that word will get out and this person would come back and she'd be able to meet him again. So that's another insight problem where, again, the solution is not obvious. We came up with a number of possible solutions. And yet when we get to the real solution, you have that aha moment. All of a sudden it all makes sense and you see that that solution fits the problem. So why are these difficult if it only requires one step, if it's not a multi-step problem? And the reason for this is going to be answered when we consider problem spaces. So we're going to take a look. We're going to introduce the idea of problem spaces now, and then we'll finish it up next time. But this is the beginning of our information processing approach, way of approaching different problems. So we'll set up the outline. We're not going to get through all of this today, but we will introduce that information processing approach. I'll be able to define operator selection, and then we probably won't get to the different types of strategies that we bring to selecting our operators, such as backup avoidance, difference reduction methods, and means-ends analyses. And we will keep you in suspense probably for why insight problems are very difficult to solve according to this, but we do have to lay the groundwork for what a problem space is in this information processing approach. So we're going to start with the kind of classic example that is used to illustrate problem spaces, which is the Tower of Hanoi. So the Tower of Hanoi, it was a problem that was invented by Edouard Lucas in 1883. And basically the problem is that you have three spaces, three places that you can legally move, three different disks, and your goal is to move the entire stack to another rod. Usually if these were made out of wood, you'd have a rod, but move the entire stack to another space, obeying the following rules. So you can only move one disk at a time. Only the upper disk on each stack can be moved. And importantly, no disk may be placed on top of a smaller disk. So you can only move one disk at a time. The upper disk on each rod is the only one that can be moved. And importantly, no disk can be placed on top of a smaller disk. So that's the problem. And we're going to take a look at this, and we'll see the solution in a bit. But we'll take a look at this because it is one of the clearest ways to define the aspects of an information processing approach. So we'll start off with the concept of state. So the state is the representation of the problem in some degree of solution. Yep. So yeah, that is how you would start it, and that's actually how you would get out of the initial state. So a state is a representation of the problem at some degree of the solution. And we have two special states. We have your initial state, and that's your start state. So this is the initial state here. You got three disks on space 1, no disks on space 2, no disks on space 3. That's your initial state. We have your goal state, and this is your solution to the problem. So your goal state is to get the disks to a different space. So we want no disks on the first space, no disks on the second space. We want 3 disks on the third space in that correct stacked order. So notice that we have our problem. We have our initial state where we start. We have our goal state where we end up with, and it's not immediately obvious how we get from this state to this state. Well, the way that we get from our initial state to our goal state is we have to pass through a number of different intermediate states. And these intermediate states are those situations on the way to the goal. So at some point in the solution, we're going to end up at this intermediate state. So this is a representation of the problem at some degree of the solution. It is one of the states that we have in our information processing approach. So what we do with all these states is we take them and we can use them to create a problem space. And a problem space are the various states of the problem. So the initial state, the goal state, and all the intermediate states. And it's also the relations between the states. And the way that states are related to each other is through what is known as an operator. And an operator is a way of moving between states in the problem space. Easy way to think about it is that this is the legal moves that you can make to go from one state to another state. So this is how you move between different states. You basically operate between one state to the next state. It's a way of moving between those states. So let's take a look at this in a more visual way. So we have our initial state right here. And from that initial state, we can apply the operator of move the top disk to the second space. That is a legal move. So we can move that operator and we end up with this intermediate state right here. On the other hand, from that initial state, we can say move the top disk to space 3. And we would end up in this intermediate state. So this now is a 3-state problem space in its current iteration, where we have an illustration of the initial state, and we have 2 possible operators that we can apply. move the top disk to space 2, or move the top disk to space 3. So let's zoom out a little bit more. So taking a look at that intermediate state on the right, we now have 2 moves that we can do from that intermediate state. So there are 2 legal things that you can do, 2 operators that you can apply. You can take that disk on space 3 and you can move it to space 2. That's one possibility. Not the best move to do, not really giving you anything, but importantly, a possible move. Alternatively, you can take the second disk on space 1 and you can move it to space 2. Those are all the things that you can do. You can't move the blue disk yet. You can't move that red disk onto the green disk because it's larger than the green disk. So these are the 2 moves you can make from that particular intermediate state. And if we take a look at the intermediate state on the left, we have the same sort of situation where we can get from that intermediate state to these 2 other intermediate states by applying the operator, the legal moves that you can make in this problem. And then we can continue on with that analysis of what are the intermediate states that are possible as we apply the operators that we can apply. And we just continue on with that, mapping out our problem space. And eventually, we are going to end up with a problem state that has our goal state in there. And that is when we have navigated the problem space from the initial state all the way down to the goal state. We have been able to find a solution by going from this state, applying the operator, ending up in this intermediate state, applying this operator, ending up in this intermediate state, applying this operator, and so on and so forth, until we got to this intermediate state and we applied this operator and we ended up at the goal space. So that is the problem solution. And this is the idea of a problem space. And the way that we would solve this problem in this problem space, according to the information processing approach, is basically finding a way to navigate this problem space so that we end up going from the initial state all the way down to the goal state. All right, so that is the problem space. That's only half of the problem space for, actually probably less than half of the problem space for a 3-disk Tower of Hanoi solution. Typically, if you buy a Tower of Hanoi puzzle, you'll end up with 6 disks in the for the Tower of Hanoi. The 6-disk solution, the full solution for the problem space is there. So in this iteration, every single one of those small little red triangles, the apex or the corners of each of those triangles is a state. So that top triangle there at the very tip, that is the goal, that's the initial state. The bottom left triangle, that is the goal state. That itty bitty corner of that triangle, is the goal state. And basically, this is the problem space, all the legal moves, all the ways that you can traverse this particular Tower of Hanoi, this 6-disk version. So you can see that problem spaces can become massive so that we can't represent them entirely in our minds, and we need a way to traverse through them in order that we can get to the eventual solution. So we're going to take a look right now. We're going to end up today by taking a look at one of the ways that we traverse these in order to get solutions. And we are going to do this by considering the hobbits and orcs problem. All right, so here's the hobbits and orcs problem. So on one side of a river are 3 hobbits and 3 orcs. They have a boat on their side that is capable of carrying 2 creatures at a time across the river. The goal is to transport all 6 creatures across to the other side of the river. At no point on either side of the river can orcs outnumber hobbits, or the orcs would eat the outnumbered hobbits. The problem then is to find a method of transporting all 6 creatures across the river without the hobbits ever being outnumbered. So you have 3 hobbits, 3 orcs on one side. Let's get this up here. We got that river. We got your boat. We got 3 hobbits on one side of the river. We got 3 orcs on the other side of the river. You have a boat that can take 2 individuals across at any time. You need at least 1 individual to bring the boat back. at most it can carry 2 individuals. So how can you go from this initial state down to this goal state? I'll give you a little bit of time to try to figure this out. And I highly recommend, if you are able to, write down your solutions, like Hobbit and Orc go across, Hobbit comes back, Orc and Orc go across, Orc comes back. Try to write those down. And my guess is going to be that for those of us that fail to solve this problem, we're going to fail in the same space. Mm-hmm.
Is it they can't outnumber or they can't equal number?
They can be equal. The Orcs cannot outnumber at any point. So they can't outnumber when they get out of the boat. They can't outnumber while they're waiting on the other side. So has anybody successfully solved the problem? All right. All right. Did anybody else who didn't solve it get stuck at a particular point? All right. I'm going to assume that your silence means yes, and that you got stuck at the point that most people get stuck in this problem. Okay, so let's take a look at this problem from the perspective of a problem space. So we'll do the solution first. So weirdly with this problem is if you follow the rules of the riddle, the problem only has one path that you can go through the space as long as you make the first choice correctly. So your only move that you can do at the beginning, you can't take 2 hobbits. Because if you take 2 hobbits across, the Orcs on the other side of the river, they're going to eat that final hobbit. You can take 2 Orcs, right? That's a fine move. That's going to be allowed. Or you can take a hobbit and an Orc. As it turns out, the hobbit and the Orc, that is your correct first move. Yep.
Can you take one at a time?
You can take one at a time, but then you'd have nobody to bring the boat back. So you could take a hobbit across the river, but then that hobbit would just come back across. Or you could take an Orc across the river, but then that Orc would just have to come back and you'd end up at the exact same position. So it would almost be like doing the Tower of Hanoi and moving a disc to space 2 and then taking it back to space 1 and then moving it to space 2. You wouldn't progress through the problem space. So we always needed to take at least 2 across and then have at least 1 return. Sorry, at most 2 across and then have at least 1 return on the return voyage. So the solution that you can do for this is on your first move, you take a hobbit, you take an Orc, you put them in the boat, you send them across to the other side. And that is your intermediate state. At this point, you cannot return the Orc. You can't use the Orc to go back across the river. It has to be the hobbit that goes back across the river. So you put the hobbit in the boat, hobbit goes back across the river, and now we're at another intermediate state. From here, we can take 2 orcs, put them in the boat, take them across the river. Everybody is still safe. At this point, we take 1 orc, put them in the boat, take them back across the river. Everybody is safe. At this point, the only move that we can do, we can't take a hobbit and we can't take an orc together, because if they do, that hobbit's going to be outnumbered on the other side. The only thing that we can do is we take 2 hobbits and we send them across. And then this is where typically if you're trying to solve this problem, you will get stuck. And the reason is, and we're going to see why you get stuck in just a moment, at this point, you've been doing the 2 across, 1 back, 2 across, 1 back, 2 across, 1 back. At this point, you can't send 1 back, because if you send back a hobbit, then the hobbit on this side of the river is going to be outnumbered. If you send back an orc, then the hobbit on the other side of the river is going to be outnumbered. The only thing you can do is send back a hobbit and an orc. So this is the only time in the problem where you have to send back 2 individuals. And then once we have that intermediate state, then we can send 2 hobbits across, use the orc to send the boat back. Then we send 2 orcs across, use the orc to send the boat back, 3 orcs across, and we've reached our goal state. So this problem is challenging to solve because the problem space, not because the problem space is very complicated. In fact, as I mentioned before, if you start with the initial state, you only really have 2 legal moves that you can make. Actually, you got 3 legal moves, but one of them is just take a single orc across, which means that you're going to take that single orc back. So you have these 3 legal moves that you can do. Only 2 of them have the 2 people going across. And if you choose the center one, once you choose that center pathway, you are locked into a problem space. There is no way to do anything other than, in this case, use a hobbit to send the boat back, and then bring across the 2 orcs, and then bring across the 1 orc to take the boat back. Basically, every single operator going from one intermediate state to the other intermediate state, once you get to this point, is fixed. You cannot do anything else without violating the rules of the riddle. And as you work through the problem space, it really is just a linear path where the only thing that you can do is follow this path. Those are the only legal moves that you can do to get to the goal state. So why is this stumping people? Why is this so difficult to do when really the correct solution is the only thing that you can do? Why is this a challenge to problem solving? Well, it has to do with how we traverse problem spaces. So it has to do with what is known as operator selection. How do you select the next move that you're going to do? And one of the heuristics, one of the strategies that we have in our mind is backup avoidance. And backup avoidance is this heuristic where we do not select an operator, we don't make a move that undoes the effect of previous operators. We try to continue moving forward with a problem, and we avoid as much as we can having to take steps backwards in a problem. So in the Tower of Hanoi, if you're traversing the problem space in the Tower of Hanoi, if you make that move and then you make that move, you are not going to make that move because that move takes you back to the initial state. So when you're traveling through this Tower of Hanoi problem, you will avoid operators that back you up. You will avoid operators that undo the effect of previous operators, and that's just a general strategy that we use in order to get to where we want to go. So backup avoidance is related to and connected to difference reduction. And what difference reduction is that we're going to select the operator that most reduces the difference between the current state and our goal. So we're going to choose whatever move we can do. If we have 4 different moves that we can do, we're going to choose the one that reduces the most the distance between where we are and where our goal state is. And this is known as hill climbing. So I'll leave you with this kind of illustration of difference reduction and what is known as hill climbing. So the kind of typical illustration of hill climbing, let's say that you are in a field, and in this field, there's a whole bunch of hills, and somebody blindfolds you, and they say, I want you to climb to the highest hill in the field, but you can't see which one is the highest. You just know that there are hills in different directions. What you can do is you can go through difference reduction. And what that means is that you take one step forward and you see how much higher you get from taking that one step. And then you take one step to the side and you see how much higher you get by taking that one step to the side. And then you take one step backwards, maybe the hill's behind you, and you see how much higher you get from taking that step. And you take a step in every single direction. And one of those steps is going to lift you up higher than all of the other steps. And that's the operator you're going to apply. You're going to start walking in that direction. And then you're going to repeat it. And one of those directions is going to get you high, and you're going to keep walking in that direction. And eventually you're going to get to the top of the hill, and you're going to step one way, and you're going to say, no, that goes down. You're going to step another way. You're going to say, no, that goes down. You're going to step in all the directions. You're going to say, no, that goes down. And you have used this strategy to reach the tallest part of the tallest hill in the field. Then you take off your blindfold and you see that there are actually other hills that are much taller. So you applied a strategy that is going to work most often, but in certain cases, you actually have to go away from your goal in order to reach the ultimate solution for the ultimate goal. And we are unfortunately going to have to wait until next time to solve the problem of the orc and hobbit problem and see why people tend to get stuck on that move where you have to send two individuals back. But that is all for next time. So that is it for what I wanted to cover today. Oh, and on that note, as I mentioned last time, we are now in exam 4 material. So the problem solving was where we began our exam 4. So I will be creating exam 3, section 3. Hopefully I'll have it done by tomorrow. So if any of you have been looking for that, just keep your eyes out. And other than that, enjoy your weekend.